Clara had spent years surrounded by the unbroken rhythm of crashing waves and the lonely echo of gulls circling above her coastal inn. Her life was a quiet one, carved out of necessity and self-preservation, much like those who choose solitude, not as a preference, but as a shield. The salty air had weathered both her inn's walls and her heart, making her cautious, deliberate, and wary of change. But then, on that stormy night, a knock shattered the predictability she clung to. It was as if fate itself had stepped onto her porch, soaked by rain and cloaked in mystery. The man standing there was unlike the rugged fisherman or the curious travelers who sometimes strayed from the beaten path. Lucas, as he introduced himself, wasn't demanding, desperate, or even insistent. He simply asked for shelter with a quiet calm that disarmed Clara's usual defenses. She had often envisioned such moments as dangerous interruptions, stories where trust led only to regret. But something in his steady gaze made her pause, as if life was nudging her gently toward a different narrative. Letting him in wasn't an act of recklessness for Clara. It was a rare decision fueled by an instinct she hadn't trusted in years. She watched him step across the threshold, water pooling around his worn boots, and felt a strange ripple within her, a shift she couldn't yet name. There was no promise of safety, no assurance that she'd made the right choice, only the undeniable reality that her long-held solitude had been breached. In that moment, her isolated life had begun to fracture. She offered him a dry towel and a place near the fire, her practiced detachment warring with an unfamiliar curiosity. Lucas didn't overshare or seek her sympathy, and in that restraint, Clara found herself strangely comforted. The storm outside howled against the shutters, a reminder of nature's chaos, while inside, two strangers shared a space thick with unspoken questions. The air was dense, not just with humidity, but with the heavy anticipation of what could unfold next. The following hours passed slowly, marked only by the crackle of the fire and the steady drip of rain from Lucas's coat. Clara observed him with the same caution she applied to mending old beams, testing for weaknesses, measuring risk. But Lucas didn't push. His quiet presence was neither invasive nor apologetic, allowing Clara to relax in a way she hadn't since childhood. It was unfamiliar territory for someone who had so carefully curated a life of isolation. That night, as the storm continued to rage, Clara couldn't help but reflect on how swiftly her world had been upended. She had often believed that change arrived with grand announcements or obvious signs, but here it was, silent, drenched, and asking for nothing more than shelter. The emotional story unfolding was one she hadn't expected to be a part of, let alone lead. Yet somewhere deep within, she recognized that the next chapter of her real story was already beginning to write itself. And as she climbed the old staircase to her room, leaving Lucas by the fire, Clara's mind wrestled with possibilities. Was this merely an act of kindness to a passing stranger, or something far more consequential? The unanswered question lingered in her thoughts, casting a quiet suspense over the inn's creaking walls. Little did she know, the connection seeded. That night would grow, quietly and powerfully, just as the storm continued its relentless dance against the shore. Days stretched into weeks as Lucas remained at the inn, blending seamlessly into Clara's carefully maintained world. Without asking, he took to repairing loose shutters, mending worn steps, and stacking firewood, each act a quiet offering. Of gratitude, Clara watched from a distance, surprised by how easily he adapted to the rhythms of the place she had guarded so fiercely. Unlike past visitors, Lucas never pried into her life, nor did he boast about his own. That silent respect spoke volumes. At first, their exchanges were brief, requests for coffee, updates about the weather, but it was in the silences that their bond began to form. Clara found herself lingering in the kitchen longer, listening, to his steady footsteps as he worked outside, feeling oddly comforted by his presence. The emotional story that neither of them voiced was building in the spaces between words, in the looks shared across the dining table, in the way they navigated the inn together without disrupting its fragile balance. Lucas's quiet competence reminded Clara of simpler times, before life had taught her to be suspicious of others' intentions. His gestures, fixing the porch light, repairing the leaky roof, were acts of care, not of obligation. Clara realized that for the first time in years, she wasn't carrying the weight of the inn alone. This new dynamic unsettled her, but also made her question how much longer she could, or wanted to, keep her heart so tightly locked away. Their daily routines became entwined without conscious effort, as if they had always known how to coexist in this isolated space. Clara, once fiercely independent, started seeking Lucas's opinion on small matters, where to place new flower pots, whether the pantry needed restocking. These simple conversations felt monumental to her, signaling the quiet dismantling of the walls she'd built to protect herself. She couldn't deny that his presence had altered the atmosphere of the inn. Evenings were the most telling, when the work was done and they sat by the fire, not needing to fill the silence with stories or questions. Sometimes Clara would glance up from her knitting to find Lucas already watching her, his expression soft but unreadable. She never asked what he was thinking. She feared the answer might make the fragile balance between them collapse. And yet in those moments, there was a warmth that made the cold sea winds outside seem distant. Clara had always believed that connections required grand declarations or dramatic gestures. But with Lucas, everything was different. It was the absence of pretense that made their bond feel real. She began to realize that perhaps love, or at least trust, didn't always arrive with fireworks. Sometimes it crept in through the back door, disguised as shared chores, comfortable silences, and simple acts of kindness. The real story they were writing together was subtle but profound. And so, as another day faded into the hush of night, Clara couldn't shake the feeling that something was shifting inside her. The routines she had clung to for stability now seemed incomplete without Lucas by her side. But even as this connection blossomed quietly, a part of her wondered how long it could truly last in a world where everything she knew had always been temporary. The evening had begun like so many others, with the wind picking up and the horizon disappearing beneath thick grey clouds. Clara, accustomed to coastal storms, moved through her usual preparations with practiced efficiency. But this storm felt different, angrier, more urgent, as if nature itself was warning her of what was to come. As the rain battered the windows, she noticed a shutter banging against the side of the inn, its hinges struggling to hold. Without hesitation, she wrapped herself in a coat and stepped out. The air outside was sharp and unforgiving, the kind that steals your breath and mocks your strength. Clara fought against the gusts, determined to secure the shutter before it caused damage. But in her haste, she miscalculated the erosion near the cliffs, a danger she had long known but never expected to betray her. One misstep sent her sliding down the embankment, her leg twisting violently beneath her. The scream that tore from her throat was one of both pain and terror. Inside the inn, Lucas heard the cry through the storm's roar. Without a second thought, he bolted outside, guided only by instinct and the faint, desperate echoes of Clara's voice. The rain blinded him, the wind pushed him back, but he pressed on, fueled by something deeper than mere obligation. Finding Clara crumpled near the cliff's edge, he knelt beside her, his hands steady despite the chaos surrounding them. In that moment, the roles of guest and host dissolved entirely. Lifting Clara into his arms, Lucas carried her back toward the inn with a strength and care that made her feel both vulnerable and safe. The journey back was treacherous, each step a battle against the storm's fury. Clara clung to him, not just out of necessity, but because, for the first time, she allowed herself to. The storm outside raged on, but within those moments of rescue, a quiet surrender was taking place in Clara's heart, a recognition that she didn't have to face everything alone. Once inside, Lucas laid her gently on the couch, quickly tending to her injured leg with the same precision he had shown in fixing the inn's creaking floors. Clara watched him, her usual walls crumbling as she realized the depth of his care. His actions weren't born of politeness or duty. They came from a place of genuine concern. That kind of devotion was something she hadn't felt in years, not since the days before the emotional story of her life had been rewritten by solitude. As the hours passed and the storm's rage softened into a steady drizzle, Clara lay awake, replaying the night's events in her mind. The pain in her leg was real, but so too was the comfort of knowing Lucas had been there, without hesitation, without question. She realized then that Lucas was no longer just a passing guest at her inn. He had become someone essential, someone she now trusted implicitly. It was a trust that terrified her as much as it soothed. And though her body needed rest, Clara couldn't close her eyes without wondering what this new chapter meant. The storm had changed more than just the landscape outside. It had carved out a new space within her, one that was ready, or perhaps destined, for something more. Yet as the embers in the fireplace dimmed, she couldn't help but ask herself, would Lucas stay long enough for her to find out? Clara's recovery was slow but steady, giving her plenty of time to observe Lucas more closely than ever before. At first, she dismissed the little things, the way he always seemed to know exactly how to fix complex problems, his precise movements, the confidence in his posture. But soon, these fragments began to form a picture that didn't quite match the drifter persona he projected. Clara, always intuitive, couldn't shake the feeling that Lucas was hiding something far bigger than his past. One evening, long after she thought he had gone to bed, Clara heard a faint voice from the old storage room. Quietly, she crept down the hall, following the sound of Lucas speaking in tones unlike any she'd heard from him before, measured, commanding, businesslike. She caught snippets of phrases, investments, mergers, acquisitions. The words felt foreign within the humble walls of her inn, as if a portal to another world had suddenly opened. Clara stood frozen, listening, her heart pounding not just from the betrayal, but from the realization that she didn't really know the man who had just saved her life. When Lucas ended the call and turned, their eyes met in the dim light. She didn't need to ask, but the question tumbled out anyway. "Who are you?" Lucas, with a heavy sigh, simply answered, "It's complicated," leaving Clara with a hollow ache of confusion and mistrust. The next morning, Clara confronted him with all the strength she could muster. She demanded answers, explanations, something to make sense of the duality she had uncovered. But Lucas only looked away, his jaw tight, his silence more painful than any lie. The emotional stories she thought they were quietly building now felt riddled with deception, and that realization wounded her more deeply than the fall by the cliffs. Unable to cope with the ambiguity, Clara asked him to leave. The words caught in her throat, but she forced them out, determined to reclaim the fragile control over her life that she had surrendered. Lucas didn't argue. He simply nodded and gathered his things, leaving the inn quieter than it had been in months. The creak of the door as it closed behind him felt like the final note of a song she hadn't realized they were singing together. In the days that followed, Clara retreated into herself, nursing both her physical injury and the fresh wound of emotional betrayal. She replayed every interaction, every silence, wondering what was real and what had been a carefully curated act. The inn felt colder, emptier, its once comforting solitude now a punishing reminder of what she had almost allowed herself to feel. The trust she had so cautiously extended now seemed foolish in hindsight. Yet even as she tried to convince herself that letting him go was the right choice, Clara couldn't ignore the lingering signs of Lucas's presence. His repairs still held the shutters in place, his firewood still warmed the hearth, and somewhere deep within, beneath the pain and pride, a small voice whispered that perhaps Lucas's story was far more complex than she was ready to admit. Days turned into restless nights as Clara tried to resume life as it had been before Lucas arrived. But one midnight call shattered the fragile routine she'd so desperately clung to. The hospital's voice on the other end was urgent. Her estranged father had collapsed, and a mysterious man had saved his life by performing CPR. Before they even said his name, Clara knew it was Lucas. There was no logic to the certainty she felt, only the undeniable pull of intuition. Rushing to the hospital, Clara's mind was flooded with conflicting emotions: relief, fear, anger, gratitude. She didn't know whether to scold Lucas for his secrecy or thank him for his bravery, but when she arrived, he was already gone, like a ghost that had slipped in to save a life and vanished without waiting for acknowledgement. The doctors confirmed it. He'd left no name, no contact information, only the memory of his selfless act. Returning to the inn that night, Clara was struck by a haunting familiarity. The porch had been swept clean of the seaweed the storm had thrown up, the firewood was neatly stacked by the door, and the lanterns were freshly refueled. All silent signs that Lucas hadn't gone far, that he'd been quietly watching over her, even after she'd pushed him away. It was a real story, unfolding not with grand gestures, but with quiet, unseen acts of devotion. Days later, as Clara sat on the worn steps of her inn staring out at the horizon, Lucas appeared, not as the humble traveler she'd first met, but in an expensive suit that glinted under the morning sun. The transformation was jarring, but his eyes carried the same quiet intensity. He didn't ask for forgiveness or try to explain right away. Instead, he simply sat beside her, letting the silence do what words could never accomplish. Finally, breaking the stillness, Lucas confessed everything. He was, in fact, a billionaire, the head of a vast corporate empire he had walked away from in search of something real, something honest. His life had been filled with boardrooms, contracts, and empty relationships, but none of it made him feel alive the way fixing a shutter or stacking firewood at Clara's inn did. His retreat hadn't been deception, it had been survival. Clara listened, her heart torn between the betrayal she'd felt and the vulnerability Lucas now showed. His confession wasn't polished or rehearsed. It was raw, filled with the kind of truth that can only come from exhaustion. She realized then that the man she had grown to care for was not defined by his wealth or status, but by the choices he had made in the quiet moments when no one was watching. And in those choices, he had revealed who he truly was. As they sat together, the sea stretching endlessly before them, Clara knew their story wasn't over. The emotional story that had begun with a knock at her door had evolved into something neither of them could have predicted. But even in that moment, with so much laid bare, one question lingered between them. Could they move forward, together, beyond the shadows of who they had been? Lucas's voice trembled slightly as he explained that his retreat to Clara's inn hadn't been some elaborate deception, but a desperate escape from a world where every relationship was transactional. Clara listened intently, her fingers absently tracing the worn grooves of the wooden step beneath her. She understood that feeling, the exhaustion of pretending, the ache for authenticity. In that moment, it became clear that both had been running, though for very different reasons. Clara had hidden behind the safety of isolation, while Lucas had hidden beneath layers of wealth and status. Yet here they were, two people stripped of their defenses, facing each other with nothing left but the raw truth of who they really were. The simplicity of their connection, forged through shared chores and quiet evenings by the fire, now shone. Brighter than any corporate accolade or solitary achievement, it was a touching stories moment neither had expected. For days after his confession, Clara wrestled with her feelings. Could she trust him again? Would the specter of his hidden life always loom between them? But then she remembered how he'd carried her through the storm, how he'd quietly maintained the inn even after she'd pushed him away. Those acts spoke louder than any title or fortune ever could. Slowly, the anger melted, replaced by something far more powerful: understanding. When Lucas asked for a second chance, he did so without the arrogance of a man used to getting what he wanted. Instead, he stood before Clara humbly, offering her not his wealth, but his presence, his time, and his heart. Clara realized that love, real love, wasn't about grand gestures or fairy tale endings. It was about showing up, consistently, quietly, in the moments that matter most, even when no one is watching. Together, they made the decision to transform the inn, not into a luxurious retreat for the elite, but into a haven for others seeking refuge from their own storms. The space that had once been Clara's fortress became a place of healing and connection, a testament to what's possible when fear gives way to vulnerability. It was no longer just her story, but theirs. A real story, crafted from resilience and compassion. Their wedding was simple, just as Clara had always wanted: barefoot on the beach, the waves crashing in the background, and a small group of friends who had witnessed their remarkable journey from strangers to soulmates. There were no extravagant vows, only promises whispered under the open sky. It wasn't the kind of wedding that would make headlines, but it was perfect because it was theirs. As they stood together, hand in hand, looking out at the sea, Clara felt a profound sense of peace she hadn't known in years. The life she had feared to hope for had arrived, not with fanfare, but through a series of quiet, courageous choices. And though their story had begun with a storm and a knock at her door, it now stretched into a future neither of them could fully predict, but both were finally ready to embrace. So what would you have done in Clara's place? Would you have opened your door and your heart to a stranger, not knowing he was a billionaire searching for something real? Stories like this remind us that life's most powerful moments often come disguised as coincidences, but maybe they're not coincidences at all. Do you believe that true connection can overcome secrets, fear, and even the scars left by the past? Or do you think some wounds are too deep to heal? I'd love to know your thoughts. Share them in the comments below. Your perspective could inspire someone else going through their own hidden emotional story right now. And hey, if you enjoyed this real story about love, trust, and the courage to start over, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. That way, you won't miss out on any of our next touching stories that just might change how you see the world, or even yourself.